Heroes, welcome to Disease Reversal and Mitigation Studio. We are grateful to God for granting us another beautiful and a blessed day, and also a rare opportunity to discuss important matters regarding our health. Today, we'll be looking up on very important dates in the medical history. And to get us off, we are going to read from the book Patriarchs and Prophets, pp 113.3, which says that the secret things belong unto the Lord our God, but those things which have been revealed belong unto us and our children. That is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 29. Just how God accomplished the work of creation has never been revealed to man. Human science cannot search out the secrets of the Most High. His creative power is as incomprehensible as his existence. So the point in reading this text is to remind us that there's some things that have been hidden to us, but human science, inspired by the evil one, have tried to search out what God has chosen to remain secret. And by so doing, it has led to error, delusions, and medical mistakes. And that is why we need to revisit some of the dates when serious medical errors were done. And they could be contributing to wrong diagnosis of diseases and their treatment today. And for that reason, we need to look up these dates. Now, the first date we need to keep in mind is the year 700 BC. In the year 700 BC, if we read from the book 2 Kings, chapter 18, verse 4, we are told that King Hezekiah removed the high places and break the images and cut down the groves and break in pieces. Now, note this, the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it, and he called it Nehushtan. So that was the year 700 BC. So the children of Israel had started worshipping the bronze snake. And this is going to repeat itself in the medical history, and that is why we need to put emphasis on this. So they were burning incense to it. Now, this kind of sacrifice, which involves burning of incense, included also sacrificing children and other precious items for the sake of this god whom they had named the brazen snake. So we are going to see the worship of the brazen snake being repeated in some dates in the medical history later. Now, another date we need to remember is the year 460 BC. So this was still before Jesus Christ was born. So the worship of the brazen snake was now adopted by the Greeks. So at that time, they used to call it the rod of Asclepius. The rod of Asclepius was being worshipped by the Greeks. It was the Greek god of medicine in the year 460 BC. So it was in the form of a rod with a serpent entwined on it, with a man standing, leaning on that rod. So please know the year. It was 460 BC in Greece. It had been adopted by the Greeks. Now, let's go to another year. Now, after Jesus had been born, in the year AD 75, there's a gentleman called Pedanius. Pedanius Dioscorides. Dioscorides. So this gentleman wrote the book De Materia Medica. De Materia Medica. This was the first pharmacology book to be written, which was based mostly, or which contained mostly herbal medicine. But in this volume, he also included the use of minerals such as mercury for treatment. So Pedanius Dioscorides came to be known as the father of pharmacology. So that was in the year AD 75 when he wrote the first apothecary, which contained medicinal substances such as plants and animal tissues for treatment. But of importance, he included the use of minerals such as mercury for treatment. So after writing that pharmacology book, it was used for about 1500 years. Up to another date, I want you to remember, this date is 1530. It's 1530. So what happened in the year 1530? Another gentleman, he was a physician called Gaspardo. Gaspardo. His name was Gaspardo Torrella, with another gentleman called Paracelsus. Paracelsus recommended the use of mercury. You know, mercury is poisonous, the poisonous substance. It has been used all the way until 1940s as a form of treatment, a very toxic substance. Sometimes it was used for dental filling in the amalgam, but it has now been phased out because of its poisonous nature. So it was Paracelsus and Gaspardo who introduced mercury in the year 1530 for the treatment of a disease called the French disease. The French disease. So the French disease is today called syphilis. So it has been converted to an African disease. It started with the French army when they were fighting. The Italians, they contracted these diseases from a fungus due to infected wounds because they were fighting in trenches. And when they were wounded, the contamination led to French disease, which presents in form of a septic or an infected ulcer. So it was Paracelsus who recommended the use of mercury for the treatment of syphilis. And it came to kill so many soldiers because it was a poisonous substance. So according to Paracelsus, he used the principle that the dosage of mercury will determine how poisonous it will be. So he is also famed, or let's not say famed, but let's say he is infamous for introducing dosages in drugs. So he used to say that it is the dose that makes the poison. So whether the drug will be therapeutic or poisonous will depend on the amount of dosage you administer on the patient. But don't be deceived, because even if it was a small dose and it was cumulative, meaning you are taking it on a daily basis, it could end up amounting to a large lethal dose. So other substances that were introduced, they were considered to be minerals, but they were introduced as form of treatment, were arsenic, Arsenic was also a poisonous substance. There was another mineral called antimony. So these were some of the minerals, together with mercury, that were recommended for treatment of various diseases. So this kind of treatment, which is based on minerals, later came to be called the iatrochemistry. Iatrochemistry. So chemicals, which comes from the word chemistry, were used for treatment. Iatro meaning doctor introduced. And this can be lethal. So doctor introduced chemicals was the second phase of medicine. Remember, the first was based on herbal medicine, herbal products. So these used to be natural from the AD 75, when DIOSCORIDES introduced his book De Materia Medica, which had largely comprised of plant products for treatment. But the second phase of treatment was introduced by Paracelsus, and it was called iatrochemistry, use of minerals introduced by doctors. Now, we will come to another phase of drugs that will be introduced later in a date I will give you in a few minutes. So because of the introduction of iatrochemistry, that is use of minerals, one of the victims of this kind of treatment was the first president of US. His name was George Washington. And this gentleman died early at the age of 67 from mercury poisoning. So he died from mercury poisoning. Mercury was administered to treat his sore throat. Today, you can use warm water, lemon, you can use eucalyptus, or you can exercise to manage a sore throat. It is as easy as that. But for President George Washington, despite being surrounded by three notable doctors, they preferred to use poisonous methods, which included administration of mercury, letting of blood, and also use of what we may consider poisonous methods of treating his disease. So he died. So they did what we call mercury administration and bloodletting. So these two mainly caused the death of George Washington. Now, if you read the book Woman of Vision, WV, page 104, now this is a letter or an addition by the editors. It will confirm that mercury, strychnine, and calomel, together with substances such as alcohol, were used during those days for treatment of diseases. So George Washington died because of serious medical mistakes. George Washington died in the year 1799. 1799. Because of a doctor caused mistake. Now let's go to the 19th century. So a few years later, after Edward Jenner discovered vaccination. So this gentleman from England called Edward Jenner In 1796, he is said to have used pus from a cow's ulcer, 1796, to inoculate a wound of a patient who is said to have had smallpox. So Edward Jenner was using pus from an infected ulcer of a cow as a form of vaccination. So during the 19th century, pus or serum from calves and cows was being used as a vaccination method. Now, I'll tell you what happened to the family of Edward Jenner because of such experimentation. Now, within a span of 5 years, that is between the year 1810 to the year 1815, let's say 1815, Edward Jenner lost 4 family members, including his eldest son, his sister Mary, another sister Anne, who died 2 years later in 1812, and then he lost his wife Catherine in 1815. Edward Jenner suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, 2 times, and he died in the year 1823. So this is the guy who has been celebrated for discovery of vaccination, losing 5 family members from tuberculosis, the disease that was contracted from cows. So he was vaccinating, or he was inoculating his patients, starting with his children with pus from cows. He ended up losing 4 family members within a span of 5 years from tuberculosis, a disease contracted from diseased animals, the same animals he was experimenting with. So please know that that is what happened to the father of vaccination. Now, another important date is the year 1853. 1853, and 1853 marks the beginning of what we call Anti-Vaccination League. So the Anti-Vaccination League, which was also known as the Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League, was established, and it was established in response to the United Kingdom's Vaccination Act of 1853, where they mandated smallpox vaccination among all infants. So we had the beginning of what we call Anti-Vaccination League. So this was a campaign against smallpox vaccination mandates. So this was during the time of the pioneers, and we know that even Ellen G. White herself was aware of what was happening, because in 1853 she was alive and she was writing the health message. So later we are going to find that the health message was revealed to her, and she was aware of the circumstances in the nations during that time. Now, let's get another year, the year 1859. 1859, this is the year when Charles Darwin wrote his book on evolution called The Origin of Species. Now, it is interesting why such a theory of evolution is coming up at this particular time. Because the prophet of God, Ellen G. White, is about to be given the health message, And Charles Darwin proposes or propounds his theory on evolution to counteract the true foundation of health, which is the true creation. So, the health message is founded on creation, or what God commanded at creation. And therefore, it is strategic for the devil to inspire people like Charles Darwin to introduce a theory that is contrary to nature at this particular time. And we know because of this theory, modern medicine is based on evolution. So it is important to understand why the devil could be this strategic in introducing or inspiring Charles Darwin to introduce his theory at this particular time. Now, I want you also to remember another date. It is 1860 when Louis Pasteur introduced the germ theory. The germ theory. The germ theory is the foundation of modern treatment of contagious diseases. So in this theory, he propounded that germs cause contagious diseases. This theory would be objected by another contemporary of Louis Pasteur, Antoine Beauchamp. Antoine Beauchamp. Antoine introduced the terrain theory, meaning germs have no problem with a healthy tissue, but they only come as a result of a diseased and decaying or dying tissue. So microorganisms do not cause disease, but they come as a result of the presence of a disease or a decaying tissue. So that is the year 1860. So we have two theories, the one of Charles Darwin of evolution and the germ theory of 1860, which have become the foundation of modern treatment today. In the year 1863, please know this year because Ellen G. White is given the health message in the year 1863. And it's worth noting because the health message by Ellen G. White will stand in opposition to the evolution theory and to the germ theory. Remember, it is also going to stand in opposition to a form of prevention of disease proposed by modern science called vaccination. So in the health message given to Ellen G. White, she proposed simple natural remedies such as good nutrition, pure air, pure water, exercise, sunshine, peace of mind, and cleanliness as a way of combating diseases, whether they are lifestyle or environmental diseases. Now let's come to another important date. Another important date is the period between 1900 to 1910. During this period, we had a gentleman called John D. Rockefeller. He was dealing in oil. He was a businessman in the oil industry. There was another gentleman called Andrew Carnegie. He was a businessman as well. And we had another gentleman, Abraham Flexner. So Abraham Flexner is known to have written the Flexner report that banned nutritional medicine and use of herbal remedies in in universities. It is John D. Rockefeller, businessman in the oil industry, who started the modern medicine after he had garnered a lot of money in the oil industry. Some of the byproducts from the oil industry and oil refinery were being wasted, and he believed they could be used for the development and manufacture of drugs. So he sponsored with Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie sponsored Abraham Flexner to write a report. And this report was to recommend that all medical schools would now be funded by the pharmaceutical companies. And in order to be funded, they were supposed to teach pharmacology, which was based on petrochemicals. So the third phase of drug development was based on what we call petrochemicals. So this means the raw materials, the major raw material for the development of drugs was petrochemicals, materials coming from petroleum. We started by saying the first, or what we call the traditional medicine, was based on herbal remedies, simple remedies from nutrition. The second one was introduced by Paracelsus, which was based on iatrochemicals. Those were minerals such as mercury, strychnine, antimony, calomel, such. And the third phase of medicine was based on petrochemicals, where raw materials from the petroleum industry, which was the first business of John D. Rockefeller, was used for the manufacture of drugs. So it is John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie who sponsored Abraham Flexner to write the Flexner report that banned the use of herbal remedies and nutritional products for treatment. And any institution that was not advancing the petrochemicals was banned and it was defunded. So that is how the teaching of nutrition was abandoned in medical schools. So another important date I want you to note is the year 1912. The year 1912. And what happened during this year? The snake, or what we call the rod of Asclepius. In the year 1912, the American Medical Association adopts the rod of Asclepius, as a medical symbol for the first time. So now you can join the dots. In the year 700 BC, the children of Israel were worshipping the bronze serpent that was raised on a tree. In the year 460 BC, the Greek started to worship the rod of Asclepius, which was sculpted in form of a gentleman leaning on that rod. And interestingly, in 1912, the American Medical Association adopts the rod of Asclepius as a medical symbol. Now that becomes the beginning of the use of this symbol as an emblem in all logos of medical facilities in the world, including the World Health Organization. So today, the rod of Asclepius is used by all medical associations in their logos. Another important date is the year 1918. In the year 1918, after the completion of the First World War, there was an outbreak that came as a result of famine, privation, war, bloodshed, use of chemical weapons, poor sanitation. So a disease as a result of poor sanitation, famine, and the difficult circumstances of the war, including congestion because of the displacement of people. Then there was an outbreak of a disease which was blamed on a virus. It was called the Spanish flu. So this outbreak was blamed on a flu virus. So they called it the Spanish flu. And this outbreak is said to have claimed between 20 to 50 million people. But we know that the circumstances of the war led to the disease. So 1918 it's important because it will become the starting point where now diseases that come as a result of poor sanitation, famine, congestion will be being blamed on viruses. And viruses are entities that are not living, they are dead, they have never been isolated, and no one knows how they look like because there is no electron microscope description of virus whatsoever, and there is no isolation whatsoever. So they're imaginary entities blamed on diseases as a result of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and also dehydration. So another important date are the years 1940s. This was during the time of the Second World War. So after the outbreak of the Second World War, we had the cutoff of supply chains of natural materials for use as drugs. It is the year 1940. The medical world or the medical establishment stopped completely use of natural products in drug development. So they started what we call commercial petrochemistry. Commercial petrochemistry. So here, John D. Rockefeller has influenced the world to adopt petrochemicals for drug development. So there were two forms of products or materials that were used for drug development. So the first one was petrochemicals. So drugs were made from petrochemicals. And the second material was mold. So you remember in 1928, it was Alexander Fleming who discovered mold, and it has been being used as an antibiotic until today. So the first antibiotic, penicillin, was got from mold, and all other antibiotics are based on molds and petrochemicals. So 99% of all drug feedstocks are based on petrochemicals. So the rest of the materials are hydrocarbons that are used for manufacture of drugs. In the year 1942, it's also a very important year to remember. 1942, we had the introduction of the first cancer drug or chemotherapy. The year 1942. So this was the inception of chemotherapy or drugs against cancer. So Hitler had bombed Italian soldiers with nitrogen gas, and nitrogen gas was converted from a bioweapon or chemical weapon into a medical weapon against cancer. So that is how chemotherapy came about. So it was used for the first time for patients who had lymphomas. The same tumors that came as a result of a poisoned environment or a toxic environment due to use of chemical weapons. The same chemicals were used for treatment of the same tumors. So that is a very important date of 1942 because it was the inception of chemotherapy. Another important date we need to remember is the year 1947, 1947/1948. This is the time where 24 directors from a pharmaceutical company called IG Farben were convicted by the court in a trial we call the Nuremberg trial because of human experimentation. So this confirms that there had been human experimentation of chemicals. The science you call science today came as a result of sacrifices of victims, people who are said to be undesirables, who are not wanted in the community. They lost their lives under experimentation with chemicals that are used today as drugs. So drugs for syphilis, like the 1932 Tuskegee experiment of black victims in Alabama, US, were experimented on to see whether penicillin can work with them. So it was a time where humans were used for experimentation. So they came up with what we call the Nuremberg Code that prohibits use of live subjects for experimentation of drugs. Another year we need to remember is the year 1952. 1952. Because after the Second World War, there was a lot of pollution, poor sanitation, there was malnutrition, people were congested in areas where they contracted a disease, and the circumstances of the war led to another epidemic of disease. It was called, again, it was blamed on a virus, so they called it the polio virus. And it will depend on how the information is disseminated and who owns the media networks. Because during this year, in 1952, only 3,145 people died from this disease they are calling polio. But do you know that more than 200,000 people in the same year had died from cancer? And we had another 21,000 dying from tuberculosis in the same year. But because of media and control of information by the big pharma, and because they wanted to introduce a vaccine, they hyped the death from polio, despite the fact that only 3,145 people died. And that is how they were able to bring up a vaccine 3 years later in 1955, which was tested, and the first trial of that vaccine led to death of 2,000 people within a span of 1 week. 2,000 people died from that experimentation of a vaccine. So the interests or the objectives of the big pharma has always been lethal, and science has been progressing from funeral to funeral. Now, another important date in the same period, that is 1952, is to know that for the first time we have a manual on psychiatric diseases being drafted for the first time. Do not forget we are coming from the Second World War. People are traumatized. There were psychiatric conditions such as depression, psychosis, and these, instead of being treated with providing a peaceful environment and compensation for the soldiers. They were treated with medications. So they drafted what we call the DSM. Diagnostic DSM means DSM. That is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Conditions. So this is the Bible of psychiatry. And since then, this book has been being upgraded. So in the year 1968, they upgraded it to DSM-2, where the year 1980, they wrote the third edition called DSM-3. In the year 1994, they upgraded it to edition 4, and currently, in the year 2013, up to today, the psychiatric department is using DSM-5 as the Bible of psychiatry. Now, let's come to another important date. In the year 1953, it's a very important date in medical history because in this year, two gentlemen called Watson, James Watson and Francis Crick, are said to have discovered the human DNA. But according to a paper they wrote in April 25, 1953, they said, and it is written clearly in that paper, that they made an assumption that DNA could be double helix. So what we call a double helix DNA today is based on assumption. At least that one has been confirmed in their own paper that was written in April 25, 1953. And this DNA, which is said to have been discovered after X-raying the cellular material more than 60 times. I want you to imagine exposing the human DNA, which is very delicate, 53 times to radiation. And then you agree with me that it will be distorted. Most likely, it will not be the structure that was originally in the living tissue. So they said they made an assumption, but today that assumption has been converted to a belief and a rigid principle, which has become the basis of explanation about DNA replication. Replication of viruses is also based on this concept. And even medication that work in the nucleus and also inside the cell cytoplasm is based on this principle. So if this principle was wrong, then everything else after that was wrong. Now, another important date that we need to remember is the year 1971. Or let's start with 1969. In the year 1969, we are told that President Richard Nixon announced the unilateral end of the US offensive biological weapons program at a place called Fort Detrick. Fort Detrick was the major laboratory that was used for biological weapons research since 1943. It was initially called Camp Detrick. So the US Army Medical Unit has always been doing experiments, including forcing people for experimentation with infectious agents that are thought to be lethal. So there is what we call Operation White Coat. Operation White Coat was a strategy by doctors to force people to be injected with experimental biological weapons such as infectious agents. And this experimentation continued all the way from 1950 to 1969, when Richard Nixon is said to have abolished that laboratory. But what I would like you to know, that in the year 1971, Richard Nixon, the same Richard Nixon, started what we call the National Cancer Institute. So the laboratory that was initially used as a biological weapon research lab was now converted to cancer research. This cancer research was just euphemism for dirty things that they were going to do, because the same Fort Detrick laboratory is the main facility where experimentation of biological weapons, including Ebola and other supposed dangerous pathogens, are experimented. So Fort Detrick laboratory is still there. It's a biosafety 4 lab owned by the US Army, and they use it for biological research. So what Richard Nixon announced, that he abolished the laboratory, he did not. In fact, he just changed the name for public consumption. So it was converted to National Cancer Institute, but the truth is the research that is going on at this moment is of very dangerous pathogens, including enhancing of pathogens to become lethal, with the hope that they might be used against enemy territories. Now let's have another date. Another important date is 1984. This is also an important date. Let's go to 1976 first. In 1976, so that you know that Richard Nixon did not abolish that laboratory and research of biological weapons continued, 1976, there is an outbreak of Ebola in Africa at a place called Ebola, okay? And also in Zaire, so today's Democratic Republic of Congo. So this outbreak came as a result of experimentation in that area. It's a war-torn area. There was civil war. Therefore, it was an ideal ground for experimentation. People were internally displaced. There were so many diseases as a result of malnutrition, congestion, and poor sanitation. So it was an ideal ground for experimentation of Ebola and other toxic substances. So during that outbreak, about 300 people died after this experimentation. In the year 1981, this is 5 years later, they are working on a program of 5 years every time. So in 1981, there was an outbreak of another disease that was called the gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome. So in San Francisco and New York, a disease broke out as a result of a very unhealthy lifestyle of anal sex, use of drugs, poor malnutrition, lack of sleep, and a disease that was marked by immunodeficiency broke out among the gay men. Now, during that year, Ronald Reagan was the president. So in April 23, 1984, because Reagan wanted to be elected as president for the second time in 1984, and there was an outcry by the gay men that they had been abandoned and they were not being treated for this disease. Ronald Reagan, through his health secretary, Margaret Heckler, on this particular date, they colluded to lie to the public in order to win the hearts of the public as to the discovery of a drug that could treat the gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome. So in April 23, 1984, Margaret Heckler, together with a scientist, Robert Gallo, lied to the public by saying that they had discovered the real cause of Graves. They said it's one of the cancer viruses Gallo was experimenting on. So Gallo is said to have discovered two viruses before that, the HTLV1 and the HTLV2. So they said the cause of Graves was a cancer virus called HTLV3. So that is how they managed to lie to the public, and Ronald Reagan was elected because they promised to provide the vaccine in 2 years' time. So they lied that that disease was caused by a cancer virus. No wonder today the treatment for Graves, which later came to be called as HIV, is founded on cancer drugs. And the first drug to be used against HIV, which was Graves, was Idovudine, which was a cancer chemotherapy drug that was abandoned in the year 1964 because of its toxicity. So that is why what we call ARVs today work inside the cell as chemotherapeutics. It's only that they have a different name, but the mechanism of action is destruction of the DNA, the same way that chemotherapy works. So please remember this date, 1984. This is the date the entire world was deceived into believing that Graves or HIV was caused by a cancer virus. And later, some years later, they would introduce chemotherapy as a form of treatment for a virus that has never been isolated, has never been seen on the electron microscope. It was just a theoretical entity which was meant to allow Ronald Reagan to be elected as president. So the whole edifice in the HIV industry is based on a political gimmick by Ronald Reagan in an attempt to be re-elected as president. So that is how Robert Gallo, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Heckler deceived the entire world. Another date we need to remember is the year February 2010. The year 2010. So February 10, 2010. So during this date, a gentleman called Bill Gates, who was in charge of vaccination, campaign for vaccination, had the following words to say in the year 2010, February 10. So he said the world has 6.8 billion people, that is headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if you do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 to 15%. So he is the gentleman who claimed that by issuance of furtherance of vaccination, they could lower the world population from 9 billion to about 6.8 billion by use of new vaccines. So those were his own words. And that is how we are able to know that the objective of the globalists in the use of vaccines is not towards improving the population, but to depopulating of the world. Now, in the year 2014, September, The president of US then, Barack Obama, predicted an airborne disease outbreak. So he said during his 2014 comments, when there was an Ebola crisis in Liberia, he predicted or he warned the US to prepare for an airborne disease. And he cited the need for better infrastructure to handle potential airborne diseases. So that was in 2014. During the same month, Barack Obama commissioned 3,000 troops to go to Liberia to fight Ebola. You wonder, what have the military to do with fighting of disease? It is because Ebola is patented by the US government. It's a biological material under the custody of the US Army, and that is why he dispatched 3,000 troops to go and secure the scene and possibly prevent invaders or unnecessary dissemination of information that could jeopardize the secrets of the US Army. So the fact that 3,000 US soldiers landed in Liberia has to do with the property, that is the Ebola virus, being a property of the American government. So that was in the year 2014. The same year he predicted the coming of an airborne pandemic, possibly the disease we call COVID in 2019. So remember another date here. This is October 18, October 18, 2019. There was a COVID-19 simulation exercise. So it was called Event 201. It was a 3.5 hours pandemic tabletop exercise that was meant to simulate a series of dramatic scenario-based facilitated discussions confronting difficult true-to-life dilemmas associated with response to what they said was a hypothetical but a scientifically plausible pandemic. So they called it the Event 201. It was meant to simulate the COVID-19 outbreak. And true to their word, in 2019, at a place called Wuhan, 2019, at a place called Wuhan, they claimed there could have been a lab leak of the Wuhan virus. In 2019, Wuhan virus. So this was later called the SARS-CoV-2, which brings the COVID disease. So the Wuhan virus outbreak, officially identified as COVID-19 and caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, began exactly December 2019 in Wuhan, Hubei province in China. It was initially reported to the World Health Organization as a cluster of pneumonia, the same pneumonia people suffer from. And this was first reported in December 31, 2019. So this tells us something. A disease with the same old symptoms of any other flu, pneumonia, is now renamed as COVID-19, and then people who are dying from other complications of diabetes, hypertension, cardiac disease, all sorts of diseases were lumped up together to have died as a result of COVID-19. And again, the media was controlled to report these cases as long as you had a positive test from a very fake test that was based on the HIV testing, the use of PCR machine and antibody-based testing for an entity or a virus that was not isolated, nor was it observed under the electron microscope. People were given a positive diagnosis, they were put into ventilators, which inflamed their lungs and caused the same pneumonia they would have prevented. So people died from other causes, but all those cases were lumped up as COVID cases. And the numbers were hiked, and the numbers were reported as a pandemic from Wuhan in China. So it's important to remember those dates because they are meant to hide. They are dates that have been based on conditions that defied what we understand in nature as the real diagnosis and cause of diseases. So it was important to remember those dates to know that human science has always gone contrary to the revelation and the creative work of God. Thank you so much. Continue to like and subscribe and share these presentations. Welcome.